The note was small, no bigger than a prescription slip, but it changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Dr. Larson didn't look at me when he handed it over. He just slipped it between the lab results, his voice steady, polite, too normal. "Take these home, Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "and read the note when you're alone." His eyes flicked up for half a second, and in that single look, I felt something cold twist inside my stomach. When I finally unfolded the paper in the parking lot, under the heavy afternoon sun, I expected maybe an apology, maybe some medical instruction I'd forgotten, but no. In his rushed, almost panicked handwriting it said, "Don't go home. Run." For a long moment I just stared. The asphalt shimmered with heat, a grocery cart rattled somewhere behind me, and all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. It didn't make sense. I looked back at the clinic doors, half expecting him to come running out to say it was a mistake, a mix-up. But he didn't. Instead, life went on, people walking past me, talking, laughing, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. And all I could think was, why would my doctor tell me not to go home? That night, I found out. And I still wish I hadn't. Before that day, my life was what you'd call ordinary. I'm Emily Collins, 41, a second-grade teacher in a small Ohio town where everyone knows everyone else's business sometimes before they know their own. My husband Daniel was the kind of man people liked instantly. Charming, generous, a community man as they called him. He ran a small construction company and coached Little League on weekends. When he laughed, he had this way of making the room feel lighter. And I believed, truly believed, that I was lucky to have him. We'd been married for 16 years. We had one daughter, Sophie, 14, quiet, thoughtful, always sketching in her notebook. She was the kind of girl who noticed when the flowers outside started to wilt or when her dad skipped dinner for the third night in a row. Our house sat at the edge of town, 2 stories, pale blue shutters, a maple tree out front that Sophie used to climb when she was little. Mornings smelled like coffee and toast. Evenings were filled with the hum of the dishwasher, the sound of Sophie's pencil scratching against paper, and Daniel's voice drifting in from the living room as he watched the news. It wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable, familiar, safe. At least that's what I thought. The week before that doctor's appointment, I'd been feeling off. It started with fatigue, the kind that crawls under your skin and lingers no matter how much you sleep. Then came the headaches, sharp, sudden, like a flash behind my eyes. Daniel insisted I go see someone. "It's probably your iron," he said, smiling as he handed me my car keys. "You always forget to take those vitamins." He kissed my forehead before I left, his cologne faint but comforting. "Don't worry, Em, you'll be fine." And I believed him because that's what you do when you love someone. You believe them. At the clinic, Dr. Larson ran the usual tests, blood work, blood pressure, nothing alarming. He was calm, professional, almost too careful with his words. When I mentioned Daniel, though, something in his expression changed. Subtle, but I noticed. He asked more questions than usual about our home, our meals, my daily routine. At the time, it felt invasive, maybe even a little strange. When I asked if something was wrong, he just said, "Let's wait for the lab results." Now, thinking back, I realize he was buying time. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. I was chopping vegetables when I heard the garage door creak open. He walked in, loosened his tie, and smiled that practiced, easy smile that had charmed everyone, from my father to the church ladies. "Hey you," he said, kissing the top of my head. "How was the appointment?" "Routine," I replied, glancing up at him. "Dr. Larson said he'll call once the results come in." "Good," he said quickly, almost too quickly. Then, changing the subject, "You'll never guess we got the Jenkins account. It's a big deal." I smiled, proud of him. We'd been through tight times before, and I knew how much he wanted that contract, but something about his excitement felt forced. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Because that's what I did best, I kept the peace. Dinner was simple roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Sophie talked about a new art project at school, Daniel about work. On the surface, everything was normal, but halfway through I noticed him watching me, not with affection, but with calculation, like he was waiting for something. "You okay?" I asked. He blinked. "Yeah, of course. Why? You're staring." He laughed lightly, the sound a little too sharp. "Sorry, I was just thinking about how lucky I am." I smiled, but a chill moved through me. His words sounded wrong rehearsed, like lines from a play. Later that night, as I rinsed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired, pale, older than I remembered, and in the faint reflection behind me, I saw Daniel standing in the doorway just watching. He smiled when I turned around, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. The next morning, Dr. Larson called. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice low. "I think it's best you come in. We need to talk about your results in person." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "Is it serious?" He hesitated. "Just come alone. And don't tell anyone, all right?" I felt my heart stumble in my chest. "Why? I'll explain when you get here." When I hung up, Daniel was standing in the hallway holding his coffee. "Who was that?" "Doctor," I said. "He wants me to come in." He frowned. "Now? It's barely 8. Yeah, I guess it's important." He stared at me for a beat too long, then smiled slow, deliberate. "All right, drive safe." And as I turned to grab my purse, I caught his reflection in the mirror again. This time he wasn't smiling. When I reached the clinic, Dr. Larson met me in the hallway. He didn't take me into an exam room. Instead, he led me to his office, shut the blinds, and locked the door. His hands trembled slightly as he handed me a folder and that note. Then he whispered, "Mrs. Collins, your blood tests show something that shouldn't be there. Traces of chemicals not found in any prescription but common in certain household substances." My throat went dry. "What kind of chemicals?" He looked at me steadily. "Antifreeze. The air left my lungs. Someone's been giving it to you slowly, over time." The word antifreeze didn't fit in my world, not in my kitchen full of recipe books, not beside the little framed photo of our wedding day that still sat on the mantel, not in the life I had built with Daniel. But Dr. Larson kept talking, his voice low, calm, careful, the way you speak to someone whose reality is about to collapse. "It's been administered in very small doses," he explained, "just enough to make you sick over time, headaches, dizziness, fatigue." I shook my head slowly, like that could undo his words. "No, there's no way. There must be a mistake." He hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, sealed plastic vial. Inside was a faint blue liquid. "We tested a residue sample from your last blood draw," he said quietly, "and we confirmed it with an independent lab this morning. I'm sorry." My stomach twisted. I wanted to ask who could do something like that, but the answer was already forming in the back of my mind, uninvited, undeniable. Daniel. I remembered the way he'd started making my coffee for me every morning, the way he'd taken over cooking dinner, insisting I rest, the sudden kindness that had felt almost performative. I pressed my hands together to stop them from shaking. Why? Why would he? Dr. Larson didn't finish the question for me. He just said, "I don't know, Mrs. Collins, but you can't go back there. Not until we figure this out." He scribbled something on a slip of paper, folded it once, and pushed it toward me. "This is an address for a safe house, a shelter, technically, but it's private and secure. Go there tonight. I'll call the authorities in the morning, but until then, you need to stay away from home." I stared at him, still clutching the note like it was both a lifeline and a curse. "But my daughter, Sophie, she's there," I whispered. "I can't just leave her." Dr. Larson's eyes softened. "If you can get her out safely, do it quietly, but don't confront him. Not yet." The drive home was a blur. Outside, the late October sky was gray, heavy with rain. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically, keeping time with my pulse. Every mile felt like walking deeper into the mouth of something dark. I thought about the way Daniel looked at me the night before, the forced smile, the questions, the coffee mug he handed me each morning, steaming, sweet, already prepared. I felt sick. When I pulled into the driveway, his truck wasn't there. Relief washed over me, cold and fleeting. I rushed inside, grabbed my phone, and called Sophie's school. "Hi, this is Emily Collins, Sophie's mom. I need to pick her up early today," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. The secretary didn't question it. "Of course, Mrs. Collins. She'll be at the office waiting." Within 20 minutes, Sophie was in the passenger seat, her sketchbook on her lap, her eyes searching my face. "Mom, what's wrong? You look pale." I forced a smile. "Just a headache, honey. We're going on a little trip, okay? Just for tonight." She frowned. "A trip?" "Dad didn't say anything." "I haven't told him yet," I said softly. "It's a surprise." We stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. I bought snacks, bottled water, and a cheap prepaid phone. I told Sophie to stay in the car and lock the doors. As I walked back to the pump, I glanced up and froze. Across the street, parked under a flickering streetlight, was Daniel's truck. He was sitting inside, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew he was watching me. The air seemed to thicken around me. My fingers trembled as I slid back into the car. Sophie looked up from her notebook. "Mom, are we okay?" "Yeah, sweetheart," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Buckle up." Then I pulled out onto the highway, not toward home, but toward the address Dr. Larson had written. The shelter was hidden behind an old church, the kind with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign out front that read Mercy Outreach Center. Inside, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Helen led us to a small room with 2 narrow beds and a dresser. "You're safe here," she said. "You can stay as long as you need." I nodded, though my mind was still spinning. That night, as Sophie slept, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my hands. They were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. Dr. Larson answered on the first ring. "Thank God," he said. "Did you get there safely?" "Yes," I whispered. "But he saw me. He was following us." There was a pause. Then, "Don't go anywhere tonight. I'll contact the police first thing in the morning." I exhaled shakily. "Dr. Larson, why would he do this? Why would Daniel?" He hesitated. "I don't know, but I checked your insurance records today and your life insurance policy was updated 6 weeks ago. Daniel is the sole beneficiary." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. The next morning I woke to the sound of Sophie whispering near the window. "Mom," she said, her voice small, "there's someone outside." I sat up, heart pounding. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a car parked at the edge of the lot. Black, engine running, lights off. Even from that distance I could recognize the shape of the truck. It was Daniel's. I grabbed Sophie's hand. "Stay away from the window, baby. Don't make a sound." My pulse hammered as I reached for the shelter's emergency phone. Helen answered immediately. "There's someone outside," I whispered. "A black Ford truck." She didn't hesitate. "Stay in your room. Lock the door. I'm calling the police. Rye." Date now. Minutes stretched into hours. Blue lights flashed through the window. Officers surrounded the car, guns drawn. But when they opened the door, it was empty. Daniel was gone. The police took our statements, promised to increase patrols around the shelter, and told me to file for a restraining order. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Every sound in the hallway felt like footsteps coming closer. But the worst part wasn't fear. It was grief, this hollow, raw ache that the man I'd built a life with might have been quietly trying to erase me from it. The next day, Dr. Larson called again. "They searched your house," he said. "They found multiple open containers of coolant in the garage and traces of it on your coffee mugs." My breath caught. Then he added, almost gently, "And Emily, they also found something else." I gripped the phone tighter. "What?" "There's a second insurance policy. One in Sophie's name. It was scheduled to activate next month." The room tilted around me. And for the first time since all of this began, I cried not out of fear, but out of the crushing realization that the man I loved had been planning a future without us. The next few days after my hospital visit were odd, not in the kind of way you can point to directly, but in those small, almost invisible ways that make your skin itch with quiet unease. When I got home that evening, Daniel wasn't there. His car was gone, and the lights were all off except the kitchen one, flickering faintly like it was struggling to stay alive. On the counter sat a takeout box from a diner I didn't recognize. Daniel was never one for takeout. He loved my cooking, especially the lentil stew I'd make every Sunday. I brushed it off. Maybe he was tired. Maybe work was too much. But then the next morning I noticed his shirt, the one I ironed for him, was missing from the laundry basket. The hanger was empty. When I asked him later that evening, he said he had spilled coffee on it and threw it away at work. His tone was light, casual even, but there was a twitch in his jaw. A hesitation so small most people would have missed it. But after 20 years of marriage, I could read Daniel like a book whose pages I'd memorized. Still, I told myself not to overthink. Maybe it was nothing. It wasn't until that Thursday when I went to bring him lunch at the clinic that the unease began to settle into something heavier. The nurse at the reception desk, a young woman named Tessa, gave me a strange look when I walked in. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she said, "Oh, Mrs. Carter. You're here for Dr. Carter?" "Yes," I said, forcing a smile. I thought I'd surprise him. She hesitated. "He's, in a consultation right now. Maybe I could let him know you're waiting?" "Of course," I said. She disappeared down the hall, and I sat in the waiting room, the smell of antiseptic and coffee mixing into something sharp and unpleasant. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. I finally stood up and walked toward Daniel's office myself. His door was closed, but through the frosted glass I could see two figures, Daniel and someone else. A woman. They were closer than they should have been, for a professional conversation. Her hand touched his arm, then his cheek. I froze. I wanted to look away, to walk back quietly, to erase what I'd just seen before it carved itself into my memory. But before I could move, Daniel opened the door. "Laura!" he said, startled. The woman turned. It was the same one from the hospital, the nurse who'd slipped me that note. For a second, the hallway went silent. Her face went pale as paper. Daniel's eyes darted between us, confusion and something else, fear, flickering behind them. What are you doing here?" he asked. I forced a small laugh. "I brought you lunch." I held up the bag, my hands trembling just enough to make the paper rustle. He took it from me, clearing his throat. "Thanks, honey. I was just discussing a patient file wit. H. Nurse Williams." She looked at me, eyes wide. "Dr. Carter," Daniel cut her off quickly. "That'll be all, nurse. Thank you." She nodded, biting her lip, then walked past me. As she did, she whispered so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. "Please, be careful. Be careful." That same phrase that had been written on the note. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching her disappear down the corridor, her footsteps soft and hurried. That night, when Daniel came home, he was unusually quiet. He poured himself a drink whiskey, neat, and sat in his armchair, staring at nothing. I sat across from him, pretending to read, though the words on the page swam in and out of focus. Finally, he said, "Laura, if you ever felt something was wrong, would you tell me?" I looked up slowly. Of course I would. "Why?" He hesitated, then smiled, that same polite, distant smile he'd been wearing for days. "Just asking. You've seemed a little distracted lately." I nodded, pretending not to notice how his fingers tapped nervously against the glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt louder, the ticking clock, the creak of the old floorboards, the distant bark of a dog outside. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment at the hospital, the look in the nurse's eyes, the trembling of her hands when she gave me that note. What did she know? What was I missing? The next morning I drove to the hospital under the pretense of dropping off medical records. I asked for Nurse Williams, but the receptionist frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't have anyone by that name working here." I froze. "What? She was here just 2 days ago." The woman shook her head. "No, ma'am, we've never had a Nurse Williams on staff." My throat went dry. When I left the hospital, I sat in my car for a long time, the engine idling softly. The note was still in my purse, folded, creased, the ink slightly smudged from my fingers. I read it again and again, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Don't go home. Run." The question that haunted me wasn't why she'd written it, but who she was running from. That night, I stayed up long after Daniel had gone to bed. The rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier, tapping against the windows like nervous fingers. I sat in the kitchen, the note spread out on the table in front of me. Every time lightning flashed, it caught the words, "Don't go home. Run." as if the storm itself was trying to make me read them again. I thought of the nurse, her trembling hands, her eyes filled with something more than fear, guilt maybe, and that look on Daniel's face when he saw her, not surprise, but recognition. For 20 years, Daniel and I had built a life on trust. Quiet, steady trust. He was my anchor through the small storms of life, our son leaving for college, my father's passing, the years when I couldn't sleep from worry and he'd make tea at 2 a.m. But now, I couldn't stop wondering, had I been the only one holding that trust together? The next morning, I decided to follow him. He left the house at 7:15 a.m. like always, dark suit, briefcase, thermos in hand. But instead of driving straight to the clinic, his car turned left toward the old part of town, near the industrial district. I stayed back 2 cars behind, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He parked outside a small, faded building with no sign, just a narrow door and cracked windows. I watched him get out and unlock it with a key. A clinic wouldn't be in a place like that. Not this one, not my husband's. He stayed inside for nearly an hour. When he came back out, he wasn't alone. A man followed, older, bald, wearing a heavy coat. They shook hands, and Daniel handed him a small envelope. The man counted through what looked like a stack of cash before slipping it into his pocket. Then he left. Daniel stood there for a long moment, looking around before driving off toward the hospital, as if nothing unusual had happened. I didn't move. I sat there in my car, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. That night, when he came home, I asked softly, pretending to sound casual, "How was work?" He smiled faintly. "Busy. We had a full day. And the clinic? Everything running smoothly?" He paused for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course. Why?" I shrugged. "Just wondering. You've seemed distracted lately." His eyes narrowed, then softened again. "You worry too much, Laura." He reached across the table, taking my hand. His touch was warm, familiar, but it felt like a stranger's hand wearing my husband's skin. That weekend, I waited until he was in the shower, then went to his office at home. Daniel was a meticulous man, every document labeled, every file alphabetized. So when I found one folder tucked behind the others, unmarked, I knew it wasn't meant to be seen. Inside were several invoices, medical supplies, large quantities of morphine, anesthetics, and surgical tools. But they weren't billed to the clinic. The supplier name was different, private. At the bottom of one of the papers was an address. It was the same building I'd followed him to. My breath caught in my throat. I took a photo of the papers on my phone, then carefully placed everything back the way it was. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop. The truth was, right there, I just didn't understand it yet. The next day, I went to that address again. This time I parked closer, near a broken street lamp. The door was locked, but through a gap in the blinds, I saw movement, shadows. And then, I saw her, the nurse, the one from the hospital. She was inside, wearing regular clothes, jeans, a sweater, but her face looked drawn, exhausted. She was speaking to someone out of sight. I couldn't hear the words, but her body language said everything. She was arguing, scared. Then Daniel stepped into view. He grabbed her arm, not violently, but firmly enough that she stopped moving. She said something, shaking her head. He stepped closer, too close. The look on his face wasn't the man I knew. It was cold, calculating. When she turned toward the window, I ducked down. My heart was racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a few minutes, Daniel left the room. The nurse stayed behind, pacing, wiping her eyes. When she finally stepped outside, I rushed to meet her. "Please," I said, "don't run. I just need to know what's happening." She froze. Her face went pale again, just like before. "You shouldn't be here. You wrote me that note," I said, holding up my phone with the picture. "Tell me why, please." She looked around nervously. "He doesn't know I warned you. He thinks I left town." "What is he doing?" Her voice broke. "It's not what you think. He's not cheating. She stopped, shaking her head. "I can't. If he finds out I talked to you, he'll—" Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed from the building. Daniel's voice called out, "Laura?" The nurse's eyes widened. "Run," she whispered. This time, I did. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. As I sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Daniel was standing outside the building, watching me, his expression unreadable. That night, when I got home, the house felt different, like it no longer belonged to me. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, every sound, all of it felt like a lie. When Daniel came home an hour later, he smiled like nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek. He asked what I'd made for dinner, and I realized as I looked at him across the table that I was married to a man I no longer knew. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there beside him, eyes open, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. He looked so peaceful, so ordinary. How could that same man stand in that building and make a woman tremble with fear? I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that I'd misunderstood what I saw. But the note in my purse, T. He nurse's face, the money, all of it screamed otherwise. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to know the truth, not half of it, not guesses or pieces. The full, ugly truth. I called my brother, David. He was a retired police officer, not someone I'd ever imagined pulling into something like this, but the only person I trusted completely. When he picked up, his voice was warm, steady. "Laura? You sound off. What's going on?" "David," I whispered, glancing toward the stairs. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise not to tell anyone, especially Daniel." There was a pause. "All right. Tell me." I told him everything: the note, the nurse, the hidden building, the cash. I could hear his breathing change as I spoke, the way it used to when he was writing a report and something didn't add up. "Laura," he said finally, "you need to stay somewhere else for a while. Come stay with me. I can't. If I leave suddenly, he'll know I'm suspicious. He'll ask questions. Then at least don't be alone with him more than you have to." His voice was calm, but beneath it I could feel his tension. "Give me that address. I'll look into it." When we hung up, my hands were trembling. That day, I went about everything as if nothing had changed. I made breakfast, folded laundry, called a client from my freelance design work, but every sound made me flinch, every phone ring, every footstep. That evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He was quiet, thoughtful. He watched me as I cooked, leaning against the doorway. "You've been distant lately." I kept my eyes on the chopping board, just tired. He walked closer, the soft tread of his shoes against the floor sounding louder than usual. "You're sure that's all?" I forced a smile. "Yes. Why?" He studied me for a moment longer, then touched my arm. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" My throat went dry. I nodded. "Of course." That night, after he'd gone to bed, I checked my phone. A text from David flashed on the screen. "That address isn't registered to the clinic or to Daniel. It's under a shell company. Name looks fake. Also, that nurse you mentioned, she's under investigation for falsifying medical records. Laura, this might be bigger than him." My heart sank. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Bigger than him. I thought I understood what fear felt like before, but this was different. This was cold. Deep, the kind that roots itself under your skin. The next day, I went to the hospital pretending I'd left something in Daniel's office. His secretary smiled when she saw me. "Oh, Mrs. Harper, he just stepped out for a meeting. Want to wait?" I nodded. Once inside his office, I scanned the room, every detail exactly as I remembered, except for one, a small black flash drive on the desk, half tucked under a file. I don't know what made me do it, but I slipped it into my pocket before I could think. My pulse was pounding so hard, I thought it might give me away. At home, I waited until I was alone to open it. It contained several documents, patient charts, test results, and then photographs. They weren't of patients. They were of shipments, boxes labeled as medical donations. And each photo had one thing in common. They were addressed to the same shell company name from the invoices I'd seen. When I opened the last file, my breath caught. It was an email exchange between Daniel and someone named RMRM. "The next batch needs to move by the 25th. We can't have more delays." Daniel understood. "I've handled the paperwork. The inventory is disguised under the medical relief shipments." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. He wasn't cheating. He was trafficking, using the clinic to move restricted substances. Maybe drugs. Maybe worse. My stomach twisted. The nurse, she must have tried to stop him. That's why she was terrified. I didn't want to believe it, but everything made sense now. The cash, the building, the warning. When Daniel came home that evening, he smiled like every other day. Kisse. D my cheek. Asked about dinner. But I could barely look at him. After he went upstairs to shower, I slipped the flash drive into my bag and drove straight to David's house. He opened the door, startled. "Laura, I have proof," I said, my voice shaking. "I think Daniel's involved in something criminal, maybe medical trafficking. He's using the clinic." David pulled me inside. We sat at his kitchen table as I showed him everything. He read the email slowly, his jaw tightening. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. "Laura, you need to listen to me. This isn't small time. These are controlled narcotics, morphine, ketamine, things that disappear into the black market. If he's caught, he's facing federal charges." Tears filled my eyes. What do I do? For now, nothing. Leave the flash drive with me. I'll handle it carefully. And Laura... He hesitated, his voice softening. "I know this hurts, but you can't warn him. If he realizes you know, you could be in danger." Danger. The word echoed through my mind the whole drive home. When I entered the house, Daniel was sitting on the couch, watching TV. He turned, smiling. "Where were you?" I froze for half a second too long. "Grocery store," I said, holding up a bag I'd grabbed on the way. He nodded slowly. His eyes lingered on me, studying. "You sure everything's all right?" I smiled. "Of course." He didn't press further, but his gaze followed me down the hall. That night, I lay awake again, the ceiling shadows shifting in the moonlight, and for the first time in 20 years, I realized I wasn't safe in my own home. The next few days felt like walking across a frozen lake. Everything looked calm on the surface, but I could hear the cracks forming beneath my feet. David had taken the flash drive to an old contact at the bureau. He said nothing would move fast. These things never did, but there was enough to open an inquiry. Enough to make Daniel's secret world begin to shake. Meanwhile, at home, I played my role. I smiled, I cooked, I asked about his day, and every time he looked at me, I wondered if he could see the truth flickering behind my eyes. One night, a few days later, Daniel came home later than usual. He smelled faintly of whiskey and rain. He loosened his tie, dropped his briefcase on the counter, and poured himself another drink. "You look tired," I said softly, watching him. He chuckled, but it sounded hollow. "Long week. The hospital's been on edge lately. Rumors of an audit." My heart skipped. "An audit?" He nodded. "Someone reported inconsistencies in our supply records. They're sending inspectors next week." He took another slow sip, eyes distant. "I can't afford this right now. I've got too much riding on it." His tone was sharp, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. I could feel the panic seeping through the cracks of his calm. I kept my voice steady. "I'm sure it's just routine." He looked at me, then really looked at me. "You think so?" For a long moment we just stared at each other. The air between us felt thick with things neither of us could say. He finally exhaled, forcing a small smile. "Maybe you're right." Then he reached out, brushing his fingers against mine. "What would I do without you, Laura?" His touch sent a chill through me. I smiled faintly, then excused myself to the kitchen, where I stood for several minutes just breathing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him I knew. But I didn't, because part of me, as much as it hated what he'd done, still remembered the man who once held me through grief, who laughed over burnt pancakes, who promised me honesty. That part of me was breaking. Me honesty. 1 day later, everything changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I was in the garden when David called. His voice was low, urgent. "Laura, they're making a move tonight. Federal agents. They have enough evidence. You need to stay out of the house." My throat tightened. "He'll know it came from me." "No," David said quickly. "They'll trace it through the bureau. It'll low." "Okay, internal. Just don't be there when they come. Go to a friend's. Please." I hung up and stared at the sky, that still, pale gray sky that always came before a storm. When Daniel came home that evening, he was unusually quiet. He kissed my cheek, but his eyes were elsewhere. After dinner, he said he needed to stop by the clinic for a bit, just to check on something before the audit tomorrow. I nodded. My hands shook slightly as I cleared the table. When he left, I sat by the window watching his car pull out of the driveway. A strange calm settled over me. I packed a small bag, toothbrush, nightgown, a few clothes, and drove to David's house without telling anyone. An hour later, the call came. David answered, then looked at me with a mix of relief and sorrow. It's over. They arrested him. For a second, the words didn't land. Arrested. They sounded distant, unreal. They found the operation records in that warehouse. David said quietly. He was moving prescription narcotics, not huge quantities, but enough. Enough to face years. I sat there, staring at the floor. My hands were still, my mind empty. My hands were still, my hands were still, my hands were still. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local physician and drug diversion scheme. His name was on every station, every article, every whisper in our small town. At the grocery store, people turned their heads when I passed, some with pity, some with judgment. One woman, someone I'd known for years, put a hand on my arm and said softly, "I'm so sorry, Laura." None of us could have imagined. I nodded, unable to speak. The hospital released a statement that afternoon. They called him a trusted member of staff who had betrayed his oath. They praised the anonymous whistleblower for their bravery. I knew that meant me, but it didn't feel like victory. That night, I sat alone on my porch. The house was silent except for the creak of wood and the hum of distant crickets. The porch light flickered in the wind, and I thought about the years Daniel and I had spent here, the laughter, the quiet dinners, the evenings we spent planning a future that now felt like a lie. I wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. David joined me a few days later. He sat beside me, handing me a cup of tea. "You did the right thing," he said softly. I nodded, eyes fixed on the fading light. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel like it." He sighed. "It never does. Doing the right thing rarely feels good in the moment. It just saves you later." We sat in silence for a long time. The sky deepened into shades of navy and gold. Somewhere out there, Daniel was sitting in a cell, the man who'd once promised me the world, now a stranger behind cold walls. And yet, in some strange way, I still hoped he'd find peace, maybe even forgiveness. Because despite everything, love doesn't vanish overnight. It fades slowly, like a bruise under the skin, tender, invisible to most, but always there when you touch it. The first few weeks after Daniel's arrest passed in fragments, bits of phone calls, paperwork, silence. The kind of silence that hums through an empty house, where every clock tick sounds like a reminder. The clinic sold off its assets. The house, too, eventually had to go. The life I had built, the dinners, the routines, the unspoken trust was gone, scattered into cardboard boxes. But I didn't break. I think part of me had already been grieving for months before the truth came out. When you love someone for half your life, you don't lose them all at once. You lose them in stages, first to doubt, then to fear, then finally to truth. David helped me find a small apartment near the lake. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, but heals. I started going on morning walks, talking to neighbors, planting small herbs by the window. It's strange how healing can come from the simplest things. The smell of wet soil, the sound of a kettle boiling, the feel of sunlight through lace curtains. Sometimes I'd sit by the lake and watch the ripples move across the water, thinking about how life keeps going, no matter what's fallen into it. I visited Daniel once. It was a cold morning in March. The waiting room was gray and sterile, smelling faintly of disinfectant, the same scent that used to cling to his white coats. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked smaller, somehow tired, but calm. He sat across from me, hands folded on the table. "You came," he said quietly. I did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There were too many words that didn't fit into sentences anymore. Finally, he sighed. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. It started as a favor, a shipment for a private clinic that couldn't get supplies. But the money, it made it easy to ignore what was wrong." He looked at me then, eyes red-rimmed. I kept telling myself I was still helping people, that it wasn't hurting anyone. My throat tightened. "You hurt me." He nodded slowly. "I know. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to yell, to demand why he hadn't trusted me. But instead, I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap. "Do you hate me?" he asked softly. I thought for a long moment. Then I shook my head. "No, but I don't know who you are anymore." He swallowed hard, looking down. I think I lost sight of that too. When our time was up, he stood, but before he left, he said something that stayed with me. "Laura, thank you for not warning me. You saved lives by letting me fall." It took me months to understand what he meant. In time, the headlines faded. People moved on. I started volunteering at a local health clinic, not as a nurse or an administrator, just helping with patient files and talking to families who needed support. It gave me purpose again, a small way to rebuild something good out of what had been broken. One afternoon, a young woman came in, her hands shaking as she filled out a form. She looked frightened, uncertain. When I offered to help, she smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you. I don't know who else to trust." Something about her words hit me deeply. Because once, not so long ago, I'd said the same thing to a nurse who'd risked everything to warn me. I realized then that maybe healing wasn't just about moving on, it was about passing the kindness forward, about making sure someone else didn't feel as alone as I once did. A year later, I finally visited the old house. It was empty now, the paint peeling, the garden overgrown. But as I walked through each room, I didn't feel sorrow anymore, just memory. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter where we used to eat breakfast. In the hallway, the faint outline of our family photos still marked the wall. And upstairs, the window where I used to watch the rain, the same rain that once brought fear, now looked peaceful, washed clean. I whispered softly to the air, "I forgive you, not for his sake, but for mine. Because forgiveness doesn't mean erasing what happened, it means refusing to carry it anymore." When I left, I closed the door gently, as if tucking away a chapter that had finally earned its ending. That night, back in my small apartment, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the soft hum of the city. For the first time in years, I felt still, not waiting, not worrying, just being. The note that had once started everything was now framed on my desk. The edges were creased, the ink fading, but I kept it as a reminder not of fear, but of survival. Because sometimes life warns you to run not from danger, but toward truth. And though that truth may break you, it also frees you. You know, sometimes I think about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's shadow. You start off loving them, trusting them, and little by little you start giving away pieces of yourself. Until one day you wake up and there's nothing left that's just yours. That's what happened to me. I wasn't just married to Daniel, I was Daniel's wife, his partner, his anchor, his silence. And when that silence cracked, when everything I thought I knew turned to dust, I realized I had to meet the person I'd forgotten me. It's strange, isn't it? How betrayal can sometimes be the only thing that truly sets you free. Because the truth, as painful as it is, has a way of rebuilding us. It tears through every illusion, every comfort, every pretty lie we tell ourselves to keep going. And when it's done, it leaves you standing there raw, trembling, but finally real. There was a time I thought I'd never stop hurting, that every morning would feel like punishment for trusting too deeply. But grief, I learned, doesn't stay sharp forever. It softens slowly, almost kindly, until one day you wake up and realize you can breathe again. You can laugh without guilt. You can look back without bitterness. And that's when you know the storm has passed. People sometimes ask me now, would you do it differently if you could? And I always pause before answering, because part of me wants to scream yes to erase the pain, the sleepless nights, the look on his face when I turned him in. But another part of me knows. That woman who walked out of that courthouse wasn't weak. She was awake. And maybe that's what life wanted from me all along. Not perfection, not safety, but awareness. To finally see the truth and still choose to live anyway. If you're listening to this, if you've ever been betrayed or used or made to feel small, I want you to know something. You're not broken. You're not foolish for believing in love. And you're not defined by the worst thing someone did to you. You are defined by how you rise after it, by how you keep your heart open even when it's been shattered, by how you learn to trust your own voice again, because that voice, quiet, trembling, honest, that's your compass. It's what leads you home. These days I don't need grand gestures or perfect promises. I've learned that peace doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. I plant my herbs by the window. I watch the sun fall over the lake. And every evening, I whisper a quiet thank you for what was, for what ended, and for what's still possible. Because healing isn't a destination. It's a daily choice to stay soft in a world that tried to harden you. Maybe, in some other life, Daniel and I would have grown old together. But in this one, I've grown stronger without him, and that's enough. So if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, staring at the wreckage of what you thought would last forever, don't rush to rebuild. Sit with the ruins, listen to the quiet, and trust that somewhere in that silence, a new version of you is waiting, one who's wiser, gentler, and finally free. Because sometimes the story doesn't end when the love does. Sometimes that's exactly where it begins.